I agree, Lisa. It is kind of weird. In 2 Corinthians 12:2, Paul writes this: I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. So what's he talking about here? Well, first, notice the way Paul tells this story. He talks about a man in Christ. Now, almost every scholar agrees that Paul is actually talking about himself here. Sort of like when someone today says, suppose a friend of mine wanted to ask you out on a date. But Paul's not referring to himself this way out of embarrassment, but rather humility. He's only sharing this experience now because he's defending his ministry against the critics in Corinth. And the timing here is really interesting. Paul says this happened 14 years ago. Now that would place it in the early 40s AD. So that would be after his conversion, but before most of his missionary journeys. So I believe he's referring to the same event that he describes in Galatians 1, where he went away into Arabia for a time and learned the gospel directly from Jesus himself. But what about the big question? What does he mean by the third heaven? Well, in first century Jewish thought, people often spoke of multiple heavens. The first heaven was the sky where the birds flew, and the second was the realm of the stars and the planets. And then the third heaven was the dwelling place of God himself. So when Paul says he was caught up to the third heaven, it's his way of saying that he was brought into God's very presence. And this layered way of speaking about the heavens actually has deep roots in the Old Testament, where heaven can mean the sky or outer space or God's throne room. So Paul isn't borrowing a foreign idea here. He's using biblical language to describe a profound encounter with the living God. And then Paul adds, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. That's fascinating. He's saying, I don't know if this was a physical journey, like Elijah being taken up, or a spiritual vision. Now, either way, the experience for Paul was real, but he leaves the mechanics of it a mystery. And so, why even bring this up? Well, because Paul is about to contrast it with something else, his famous thorn in the flesh. The Corinthians were impressed by flashy spiritual experiences, but Paul wants them to understand the true mark of an apostle isn't heavenly visions, it's living in God's power despite weakness. His point in this passage is that Christ's grace is sufficient, and God's power is made perfect in weakness. He's reminding the believers in Corinth, and by extension believers today, that Christianity isn't about chasing mystical experiences. It's about depending on God's grace, even when we're weak.